CNT120. We are in the we're doing the chapter 1 lab. We are now on layer 3. So layer 1, we checked our patch cable, followed that through. That's our layer 1 link. Layer 2, we looked at our network card, and we looked at it a number of different ways. We looked at the actual physical part. We looked at it in Device Manager, in different network utilities, and even command prompt. For layer 3, we're now focusing on the IP address. So we're going to take a look at the IP address settings on our computer and also do what's called a ping. Ping is actually sending a little data packet to see is there a pathway to another node and back, if you will. So with layer 3, we're focusing on now the IP address. This is the IP address assigned to this PC, typically through a server. A server actually hands it the IP address and it borrows it for a while. This IP address is a layer 3 address, also called all of these other names. And this gets used by devices like routers to route the data through the network and get it to the correct network, if you will. And I use the example here of the Harrisburg campus of Hack as opposed to the York campus of Hack. Data coming from the internet, the router's going to route it to the appropriate campus. Once it gets there, the router's like, I'm done with y'all. It's now going to use the MAC address at layer 2. The switch will use the MAC address to get it to, my computer as opposed to my lab partner's computer. So we're now going to look at the layer 3 addressing. So on my PC, I'm going to go look at my network and sharing and the settings it has. So I'm going to close my command prompt. I'll get back to that later. I'm going to open my network connections. So I'm going to right click on the Windows icon. I'm going to open my network connections, and right here I'm going to look at I'm going to open the network and sharing center. So I'm going to go down here, network and sharing center. Again, this is kind of like a Windows XP, Windows 7 view that a lot of people are used to. I'm going to locate my Ethernet NIC, and I'm going to open that. So I'm going to open my Ethernet 3 that's here. And here is the Ethernet 3 properties, if you will, my network properties. And I'm now going to open the properties of that NIC. So I'm going to open the properties here of this NIC. This is what we're now interested in. We're looking at the what's installed on here. So I'm going to continue down here on the next page. I'm going to look at these things. I should see that there's a client for Microsoft Networks on there. So if this computer needed to be in a Windows client server environment, this would allow that. This would allow this to sign into a Windows server. This is the client on here that will allow it to sign into a Windows server. We see file and printer sharing. This is now here, or this is here to allow file and printer sharing. So in other words, to be set up on a peer-to-peer network. The third one that's here is our TCP/IP address, or our Internet Protocol version 4 address. This is our TCP/IP address. This is the addressing that's happening at layer 3 for this computer to communicate on the network. So we're going to open those settings. So I'm going to highlight this and click properties, or if I double click it, it works. Either one. I'll highlight this, I'll click properties. We're now going to look at how is this set up. Right now, it's selected for obtain an IP address automatically. What this means is it's going to dynamically get an IP address. When this computer boots up, it is actually going to go ask a server for an IP address. Say, hey, server, can I borrow an IP address? Well, it's a DHCP server is what it is. It's going to say, hey, DHCP server, can I borrow an address and use it for a while? And the server hands an address to it saying, yeah, go ahead and borrow this. Almost like renting bowling shoes from the bowling alley. Oh, here you go. Here's a pair of shoes to borrow. Bring them back when you're done. It's going to get an IP address and borrow that, including the DNS information down here. Many networks are set up to do this because it doesn't require the user to plug any information in. You noticed ours is set up like that. Now, if I were to use the following IP address, you notice all that opens up and I have to fill it in. This we're going to use in our labs. As we do labs this semester, we will use this setting. Not yet, but we will. But this actually requires the user to plug in an IP subnet-masking gateway. And if one digit is wrong in here, it's very possible this computer will not communicate. So this is not common in most networks because it requires the user to plug all this in. We are going to use it for labs. But for right now, we're going to leave it on dynamic like most networks use. So take note of those two settings. This is a dynamic setting. The second one here is a static setting. Okay. So How would I verify? I'm literally going to go into these TCP/IP4 settings and see what is it set as. I'm going to keep going. Now, we're going to look at the command prompt of like, what is the IP address that's here? Because you'll notice, I'll go back in here, it doesn't show me anything about what IP address is assigned to this. It says borrow one, but it doesn't show it to me. Some operating systems will show you it here. Apple does, some Linux versions do, but Windows typically does not show you the IP address that is obtained here. So I have to go another way to find that. So I'm going to close this. I'm just going to say okay to all these. I'm just going to close it. I didn't change anything. I'm going to close all those. I'll even close this one out here just to declutter my screen for you. I'm going to open my command prompt and I'm going to issue a command. I'll use the shortcut down here. Okay, and actually let me make my font a little larger. Boop, boop, boo. Let's do font and let's make him a little larger. Let's try that. That's a little better. What I'm going to issue now is I'm going to issue the command ipconfig, but no extras. Previously, we used ipconfig and we did /all. We don't want that. We just want the basic ipconfig. I don't need all the extras. Just give me ipconfig. So when I do that, I'll look at Ethernet 3. Here's my Ethernet 3 settings. There is my actual IP address. That is the IP address that was assigned to this. When this computer asked the server for an IP address, this is the one that got assigned. So there is my actual IP address. Now, I'm going to make note of this, and my lab partner will want to do the same thing. We're going to need that in a little bit. So just kind of make note of what that is. Now, at this point, can I tell if this was actually static or dynamic? If I didn't go look at it, like I did a minute ago, could I tell if this is static or dynamic? Not really. So what I can do now is I can do ipconfig /all. When I do ipconfig /all, again, I get, like I did earlier, I get all of this extra stuff. I get the physical address, etc. But I'm going to look down through. It shows me DHCP is enabled. Oh, okay. Here's the IP4 address. If I look here, lease obtained, lease expires, that's when it got its IP. So this computer turned on this morning at 9:16, if you will. It'll keep this IP address until, a couple days later in the afternoon. So it can actually use this IP address and keep it. Here's the IP address of the DHCP server. So now that I'm seeing all this information, I now know this is a dynamic address. This was set as obtain IP address automatically. So now I know by looking at this, is it static or dynamic? Well, I know it's dynamic now. Okay. And since I see a usable IP address, this is also letting me know my layer 3 should be functioning. It should be functioning. All right. I'm going to leave that open. I'm now going to verify, is layer 3 working? And I'm going to do that. With what's called a ping. Ping is a command that actually sends a little data packet to another node and then waits for a reply. Almost like ringing somebody's doorbell and waiting for them to come to the door. If I ring the doorbell and they come to the door, then I'm like, oh, I guess you're home. If I ring the doorbell and they don't come, I'm going to assume, well, I guess they're not home. That's what this is. I'm going to ping. I'm going to send a data packet to another computer. If I get a reply back, then I know they're there and my layer 3 is working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my neighbor, what is their IP address? And then I'm going to issue the ping command, and I'm going to plug in their IP. So I'm going to plug in, I'm looking at my, I don't have a neighbor right now, but I'm looking at the computer next to me, and I'm going to plug in that IP address, 172.21.40.97. That is my neighbor IP. Make sure it's not going to go to sleep over there. There we go. And now I'm going to hit the enter key. Now, I need to make sure there's no typos here. I'm using the ping command, space, and then the IP address. I'm plugging the actual IP of that computer, 172.21.40.97. And I'm going to hit the enter key. If that computer is there, if it's on, if it's functioning, I should be getting replies from. That shows me a successful reply. And that is now telling me my layer 1 link and my neighbor's computer layer 1 link is working. My layer 2 NIC is working. My neighbor's layer 2 NIC is working. My layer 3 IP addressing configuration is working. My neighbor's layer 3 IP addressing configuration is working. Because all of those layers are working, I'm getting a successful reply. If they were not, let me put in here something like, let's try that. I don't think there's any computer in my room right now that has that IP address. So I'm pinging something that's not out there. So I'm getting a destination unreachable. Like, no, they're not home. They're not home. That would let me know something in my layer 1, 2, or 3 of my machine or my neighbor's machine, layer 1, 2, 3, is not functioning. That's what that would tell me. But since I did get a successful reply, that lets me know that layer 1, 2, and 3 on mine and layer 1, 2, and 3 on my neighbor's is working. Woohoo! That's what that tells me. What I'm going to do now before I leave here is I want to copy the IP config all, and I want to copy my ping results. So I'm going to scroll up here a little bit, and I want to copy all of that IP config all because I want to see all of the this right here, this Ethernet 3, the one we did. I'll copy all of that because I want to see the DHCP and everything so we know it's dynamic. I'll hit the enter there. I'm going to go to my notepad over here. I'll put a note here that this is my layer 3 results, and I will paste that in. So there's my layer 3 IP config. The other thing I want is the ping. I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to go to, here was my successful ping that I did last. So I'm going to copy that. There's the command and the results. Enter. And I'm going to paste that in. There's my successful ping. So that shows that everything on my machine layer 3 is working. And I want to save that updated file. So there is my layer 3 functioning in my network. We'll come back in the next podcast for layer 4.